meeting. Unfortunately, there weren't any waffles on the menu because my speciality is waffling, but I'm going to keep it brief this morning. I'd like to just start by acknowledging the remainder of our sponsors who have been most supportive. The Medical Library Association. Is Jean Shipman in the audience? I'm afraid I've not met Jean yet. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you.
There's been sponsorship from the UK, from the Helicon organisation. It's not actually Helicon Publishing, but it's an organisation that is designed to promote good practice in terms of accreditation activities and dissemination activities. And certainly another of our financial sponsors was the donations from Elsevier, so we thank all those. And of course, sponsorship isn't just about providing money, although that helps. We've also had a lot of support in disseminating details of the conference from the Association of Research Libraries, the Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice Journal, Information for the Management of Healthcare, a subgroup of the Health Libraries Group, Special Libraries Association, the Taylor and Francis Group, Thomson Scientific, and the Triangle Research Libraries Network. So we appreciate all that. Now, some of you may have come across in your wandering around the web something called the Journal of Improbable Results. It does exist, honestly. Well, if there was a Journal of Unforeseen Consequences, perhaps a sequel to it, then certainly that would be the case for what was a national conference that we ran in Sheffield, getting on for 8 years ago. And at that time we had 4 international participants, and the rest were just ordinary jobbing health librarians from the UK. And at that point, we would have never anticipated that this interest in evidence-based practice, as reflected in this room, would grow across sectors, would grow across national boundaries, would grow across topics, so that all the topics, collection management, information retrieval, that it would extend over that. And certainly, it's not only grown in its sort of geographical spread and topical spread, but in its influence, and certainly in the quality of the work that's reflected by all the presentations and posters we're looking forward to over the next few days. Now, I'd like to extend a challenge as well as a warm welcome, a challenge to those of you from the United States. You very rightly have a tremendous reputation as producers of research. Certainly in the health field, which is my own particular area, we're always looking to the United States and the valuable research that's being produced there. But I just want to stress the fact that this is not about repackaging, or in the UK we use the expression of retreading the tyres. This is not about repackaging research, it's about getting it into practice, it's about using it in decision making. So many of you may have been to research conferences in the past, but I just want you to think of that extra a few links of the chain about how do we get these valuable research studies, many of them conducted here in this country, how do we get those to make an influence in practice? And that's really the whole driving force of the evidence-based practice movement. And so every time we go to a presentation, there's a challenge for us to say, how can I use this research in our practice? And certainly the last 2 conferences have seen some very fine deliverables out of them. The Canadians have followed up their conference by producing this excellent journal, Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice, about which you'll hear more throughout the conference. The Australians have been working on practical tools for evidence-based practice. How do you get it into project management? How do you use this in your day-to-day results? So the challenge really, particularly for those of you who are hosting us, and we're very grateful for your gracious hosting, is to think, well, what is the impact, the import of this conference for day-to-day library practice and decision-making? We certainly have a fantastic programme. I'm using that not hopefully in the literal sense, but in the sense of hyperbole, or perhaps hyperbole as you might know it over here. But isn't that a sort of American football event? No, that's quite close. But there's a rich variety of topics in the programme, but of course the programme committee can't take any credit for that at all, because we've had some excellent articles submitted as abstracts and posters. So to a certain extent, You take all the credit for the quality of the programme. On the other hand, if you come to me on Wednesday and say it wasn't any good, then that was because your posters and presentations were not meeting the grade. So I think we've got everything to share together here in enjoying that particular aspect of the programme. So thanks to all of you genuinely for providing such fine materials. I'd like to thank the local organising committee. We've had lots of acknowledgements so far, but especially Joanne Marshall and Carol Perryman. I've had more communication with them than my wife over the last 6 months, but at least I've now got the EBSCO bag to take back as a make-up present. So I'd like to wish you all an enjoyable conference. I'm looking forward to meeting so many names that I recognise from around the world, and the opportunity to network both during the intermission through the programme and of course at the social occasions. And thank you very much for hosting us here. So I'm now going to put on another hat, which isn't difficult when you've got a big head like mine. It's a great pleasure now to be able to introduce our first speaker, Margaret Haines. I could attempt to list all of her high-profile, influential positions, but we've only got an hour in the programme today. But certainly if you look at the biography, you'll see that Margaret has had a tremendous impact, particularly on the UK stage, but in the international arena over the last few years. And certainly just listing those roles doesn't do justice to Margaret's role in furthering evidence-based practice, both within healthcare and within our own profession. It would be a bit like looking at an X-ray and trying to see the whole person. And so really Margaret's contribution goes far beyond that. But just to say that Margaret has been involved in encouraging good practice when she was at the King's Fund, commissioning research, such as when she was with the Library and Information Commission, evaluating research, such as when she was a Research and Development Director in the South East NHS region, implementing the evidence in her role at King's College, and championing the evidence as the leader of our profession in the UK, as the I'm never sure whether it's chief exec. No, it's president. Thank you, president of CILIP, which is our professional association. So I'm not going to dwell on that. I'd just like to offer two personal observations. It's all right, they're not that personal. Before I introduce Margaret, first of all, within our profession, we're very fortunate. There are thousands of librarians who can enthuse people. There are tens who can influence people. Now, in my career, I've only worked for two who can truly inspire people. And Margaret's certainly one of those, not just by words, but also by leadership, by modelling what we preach, so to speak. My contact with to the pre-evidence-based librarianship days, when we were both at the King's Fund, but even there the seeds of evidence-based practice were there. Quite rightly under Margaret's leadership, we were being known for work in quality improvement in information and library services, and for a culture of reflective practice. And of course those are two of the key ingredients now of evidence-based library and information practice as we know it. So the first thing then is to acknowledge that it's a great privilege and pleasure to be addressed by Margaret on this particular title, Professionalism and Evidence-Based Practice. The second personal observation, those who've heard Margaret speak know what I mean when I say that she gives better value minute for minute than any other speaker I know. So I'm seamlessly going to make the transition from introducer to timekeeper. So can I invite you all to welcome Margaret Haines.
Thank you, Andrew, very much, and thank you to Joanne as well. I have two great reasons for being here, and they're both sitting at the table with me. I've been a dear friend and colleague of Joanne's for over 30 years, going back to 1973 at McMaster University. And Joanne has really been my mentor in my career. I've always followed in her footsteps. She was a medical librarian at McMaster, so was I. She started the first clinical librarianship program in Canada. I started the second. She was a research librarian in the Faculty of Continuing Medical Education, and I was the second. I followed her into doctoral studies, and I have to say I didn't finish. But the one thing I learned from Joanne is, and Andrew's kindly said some of the things about me, but for Joanne, not only is she an enthusiast and a cheerleader for all of the good things in our profession, but she's always been the one who's spotted the good idea and gone for it right away. And not only gone for it, but she's also persevered like the Tar Heels and actually delivered research and lots of leadership and lots of good ideas and lots of collaboration. So I've learned a lot, and I still learn a lot, and she's my big sister. Now, if Joanne's my big sister, Andrew is my little brother. I was going to say my son, and I thought, I'm not that old. But I hired Andrew at King's Fund Centre in the early 90s, and he was a challenging employee, I have to say. And he was challenging because he was always challenging me, always asking the questions. Why are we doing like this? Why couldn't we do this? What does the research show? So if there was a reflective practice at King's Fund Centre, Andrew, it was because of you, actually, not because of me. And I think it's an important point to make that as library leaders and employers, we learn a lot more from our staff, I think, than they learn from us. So I thank both of them for being inspirations to me and for inviting me here. And I'm a bit embarrassed to stand up here, a bit of a fraud, actually, because this is the 4th EBLIP conference, as Joanne said, and this is the first one that I've been to. So for somebody who's been on the fringe of evidence-based practice, I'm embarrassed but delighted that I'm actually at my first EBLIP conference. When Joanne asked me to speak, she asked me to give a personal reflection about my experience with evidence-based practice, and that's what this is going to be. It's going to be a journey, and I want to share with you some of the drivers that have brought me to the point I am today, where I'm actually going to stop being a cheerleader and be a player. I want to put on the jersey. I want to be in the game with the rest of you. So instead of being on the sidelines, I want to be in the thick of it. But I want to tell you how I got there. So what I propose to do is give you kind of a personal journey in this presentation. We'll basically explain to you some of the drivers for encouraging evidence-based practice over the years, and they will include my experience with different kinds of evidence-based practice, my experience in terms of developing a concept of professionalism in the practice in the UK, my experience again with knowledge management, and also some of the organizational change that I've come across recently that has made me really convinced that evidence-based library and information practice has to be at the core of my professional career. And then if I have time, and Andrew has been told that's all right, he can interrupt me, and it won't cut short his career if he says, Margaret, you're running out of time. I'm going to give you 2 very short case studies of how in the last 4 years, when I've gone back into academic librarianship, of how I tried to implement evidence-based practice in these organizations. And then give you some conclusions and some things I think about the way forward for our profession. So in terms of our evidence-based practice, and my first driver, which really led me to today, I'm going to explain a little bit about my experience with evidence-based medicine and what I learned from that. And my involvement in evidence-based medicine has been originally as a practicing health librarian, but also as a policy advisor in government, both in the Department of Health and the Library and Information Commission, and then most recently as an R&D director in the Department of Health. And then I want to talk about the early experiences with evidence-based librarianship and what I learned from Andrew and Anne Bryce and Alison and other people in the UK about EBL, and also how that influenced my thinking as CILIP president, and again as a policy advisor and as an employer. And finally, my most recent experience with evidence-based education in 2 universities, one in the UK and one in Canada, and how I experienced evidence-based practice both as an administrator and an educator. So let's start with evidence-based medicine, which has been described in the literature as pragmatic empiricism. In other words, not how or why, but what works. And Dave Sackett said in 1998, that evidence-based medicine was a conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. He went on to say that it was really a bottom-up approach which integrates best external evidence with individual expertise. And he emphasized a lot that it has to be a bottom-up approach and not a top-down approach. And in the UK, we had seen quite a lot of top-down approaches in the Department of Health and the NHS, with guidelines and lots of literature being disseminated, but actually not changing practice very much. And Dave Sackett said that really evidence-based medicine is a lifelong self-directed learning, and that's the only way that we're going to fundamentally change individual practice. So evidence-based medicine has a focus on fair and rigorous comparison of the effectiveness of treatment. And that led, of course, to lots of discussions about the hierarchies of evidence, with the double-blind RCT as the gold standard, and focus on systematic reviews of evidence in order to inform decision-making. The process, as you know, and I'm sure I'm not going to be telling you anything new, starts with converting information into answerable questions, then finding the best available evidence to answer those questions, to critically appraise that evidence for validity and usefulness, and then two very important steps, and I think both Joanna and Andrew may have mentioned this. It's about applying the results of that critical appraisal to your professional practice and evaluating whether it makes a difference, evaluating the resulting performance. And that's what Dave Sackett would say differentiates, in a way, evidence-based medicine from CPD. Those last two steps. It's not just about finding the research literature, it's applying it to your own practice and seeing the difference that it makes. So for me, the big turning point with evidence-based medicine came in a conference in 1993 with the Canadian Medical Association, and I was currently in England at that time working with Andrew, and I went to this conference when I went home to Ottawa. And what really struck me at that conference was that there were 300 physicians in that room. It was one of the first times that Margaret Haines and others had really addressed the whole of the Canadian Medical Association conference. And I was the only librarian. And I remember looking around the room and thinking, this is such a potential opportunity for us as librarians to play a role in evidence-based medicine. Why am I the only one here? And I went back to my colleagues in the UK and said, we really have a role here. We have an opportunity. And I have to say that, you know, I was promoting this, and others like Andrew were as well. But the great thing was we had a wonderful champion in Dr. Muir Gray, who was then Director of R&D in the Oxford region. And Muir also saw the role that librarians could play in evidence-based medicine. And he gave us lots of money and lots of support to really hone our skills as librarians, to be sure that we were there in the critical appraisal part, in the finding the evidence part, in instructing physicians how to do this. And so it's a tremendous support for us that the library role for health librarians anyway expanded greatly as a result of evidence-based medicine. So sort of in summary, I would say that with evidence-based medicine, there were initially some controversies about the lost art of medicine and some of the debates that we've already had about the types of evidence. But I think it's safe to say that evidence-based medicine is a paradigm that has not gone away. It's firmly embedded, I think, in medicine. So that was one of the influences that took me forward. And the second one, chronologically, was evidence-based librarianship. And as you know, it emerged in the mid to late 1990s, both in the UK and over here. It certainly was a feature of Medical Library Association 1995-96, and also in the UK. And there were lots of advocates, many of whom are around this room at the moment, from the UK, United States, Canada, and Australia. And Andrew has already mentioned the SHAR-sponsored conference in 2001. And as I've been watching evidence-based practice, and at this point in the late 90s, I'd left health librarianship and I was working for the Library and Information Commission. So again, on the sidelines, seeing where this movement, which had emerged from medical librarianship, was having an impact on libraries across the board in the United Kingdom, and trying, in my role as the chief exec of LIC, to promote other library sectors to pay attention to what the health library sector was doing. So over the years, we've seen wonderful initiatives, the tools and guidance that have come out, things like the Crystal Checklist, Template, the Folio course, journal clubs, Andrew and Anne's book in 2004, which I still use as a Bible, and of course the EBLIP Open Access Journal, which if you haven't subscribed or registered to use, please do. It is free, but you do need to register to use it. So what I've been doing is watching the whole emergence of evidence-based librarianship, and more recently library and information practice. And the interesting things that I've observed have been things about the debates about the nature of evidence, the quality of evidence, some of the issues that come up from practicing librarians saying they don't have time to practice evidence-based practice, that they don't have the research skills or the critical appraisal skills, that there's still a gap between what practitioners want in terms of research questions answered and what is actually being delivered in the research. But on the whole, I think there's been a huge movement, and the whole conference here is an example of that, of how evidence-based librarianship is becoming more and more a part of what we see as practitioner and professional standards in librarianship. So that was, again, another influence on me. But more recently, I've been involved in evidence-based education, and I took my first university job in 2003 at King's College in London. And I was interested to know, in this education sector, how did evidence-based practice develop? And you'll see a quote that's up there by Fitzgibbon, which says that education remains largely a product of plausible belief and convenient practice admixed with the need to adhere to policies that are mandated politically. And what that really means is a kind of an eclectic research paradigm in education, that there are still a lot of people who are not sure that the evidence-based model really applies to education. And another quote from Jackson I think is quite revealing. He said, "There are some things that we can learn from medicine, but in education we know we have a much tougher job interpreting and applying evidence in practice. Teachers and lecturers aren't dealing with just one patient at a time, but with large groups of students who affect each other's learning, all with different needs and all at the same time. Researchers have the luxury of freezing the frame and looking at particular parts of this mix. Teachers have to interact with it all dynamically and quickly. So research evidence is only one kind of knowledge, and it has to be integrated with our own equally important practical skills and knowledge." So the issues that are coming out of evidence-based education when I started in 2003 were still very reminiscent of what I've just said about librarianship. It was around the nature of the evidence, how you actually do evidence-based practice with qualitative, observational case studies and action research. And there were a lot of ethical and cost issues around trying to apply more rigorous methods like RCTs in education. There was a strong view that tacit knowledge and reflection are equally important in education. And there was a concern that pragmatic empiricism, to come back to what EBM was seen to be, that what perhaps was inappropriate in education. So the evidence-based education sort of view with its sidesteps theoretical debate, and evidence-based practice was too easily ignored by policymakers. So come back to the first quote that you can see up there. There was a concern that even with the good education research, policymakers were making decisions that weren't based on that evidence. In the 1990s, the Department for Education and Skills in the UK did a review of research in education and found very fragmented priorities. And my phone, embarrassingly, is just ringing in my bag. I'm sorry about that. You're going to have a message that says incoming call in a minute. My apologies. That there's been a review of, the review of research found that there is a fragmented picture of research in education, very much supplier-driven, not practitioner-driven. And DFES was quite concerned about this and did a significant number of things to try to address it. The first was creating the Evidence for Policy and Practice Information Coordinating Center in '93, which was looking at an international collaboration around evidence for decision-making in the social and behavioral sciences. And that was followed up by, it actually became part of the Campbell collaboration in 2000. Later there was REAL, the Resource Evidence of Education Research Library. That was started in 2000, and also the Center for Evidence-Based Policy and Practice at Queen Mary College, also in 2000, which was there to facilitate the exchange of social science research between practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. So there was an effort in the UK, anyway, to improve evidence-based education. But I think the main thing that came out of this education view was that they needed this eclectic research paradigm. And in higher education, where I was working, evidence-based education was slightly slow to emerge. But in 2004, the Higher Education Academy sponsored a whole debate about evidence-based practice. And again, the same issues came up: the lack of time, the lack of confidence of people to practice evidence-based research, the lack of capacity to integrate evidence into practice, the bias towards positive results, the lack of good institutional role models, the lack of trust in systematic reviews at the time, and the timeliness. And so the recommendations that came out of the Higher Education Academy were that we need more guidance and tools, more communication between policy and practice, a link to professional standards for teachers, and we need to engage other stakeholders. And if that sounds familiar, it's because of exactly the same things that are being said in evidence-based librarianship. So overall, in terms of evidence-based practice over the last 15 years, what I've learned is that evidence-based practice is a means of ensuring that what we do is worthwhile and being done in the best possible way. But there are still many issues around the types of evidence, the methodologies used, and the alternative paradigms. And there are still issues about gaps in the research literature to address practical problems facing practitioners. And I think the key thing that I've been taking away is that using evidence to change practice is not a linear process. That changing individual behavior requires reflection time, confidence, skills, accessible evidence, and expertise. But for me, more importantly, as a senior administrator in a university, changing organizational behavior is very difficult, and explicit evidence and tacit knowledge are only two of the factors that will change organizational behavior. I think one thing I'd like to share with you is some comments from Frederick Wold. I don't know if you've read this article. He said there are 10 lessons to be learned from evidence-based medicine and evidence-based education. And these are his order. They don't actually make sense to me in terms of logical order, but here they are. The number one lesson was that synthesizing evidence is much more complex and complicated than we originally thought. I will say yay to that. Number two, that synthesizing can be done in a systematic, organized fashion in which international collaboration, cooperation, and volunteerism are possible. And I think if you read Andrew and Anne's article in the February 2007 issue of EBLIP journal, the Open Access Journal, you'll hear that this is echoed in there, that we need this international collaboration and cooperation to do the reviews and to coordinate and develop a research strategy. His third point is that resources are necessary, but the return on investment is significant. And as a former director of R&D, I can say that the Department of Health and the NHS did take this view, that it was worth investing in a Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. It was worth investing in organizations like the Cochrane Collaboration to do the reviews. And the return on investment in terms of saving patients' lives and reduced patient stay has been significant. I think that's one of the issues and the challenges for us in the library profession, that we haven't had that influx of resources that probably could move us that much faster in the maturity chain that has happened with evidence-based medicine. Wold also said that specialized registers or databases of primary studies are useful, that there are multiple audiences with differing needs, as we know, that translating evidence into practice is more difficult than generating evidence, which I think is what Andrew was saying in his introductory remarks, that secondary databases may be more efficient than primary databases for accessing good quality evidence real time. A lot of people don't have the time to actually apply the critical appraisal skills and search the literature. They want someone to have done it for them, the summary databases. That evidence alone is insufficient for making good decisions. That high-quality systematic reviews can help improve the quality of primary research because they identify research gaps and methodology issues. And that how evidence is framed and communicated can influence decisions. And I think that's a very important part. Again, to hark back to Andrew and Anne's article, communication seems to have been one of the key issues for us in our profession in evidence-based practice. How we communicate research results, how we communicate between practitioners and researchers, how we influence policymakers. So all of those things are what actually took me along the path, I think, to my own evidence-based practice. The second driver that I want to mention is library and information professionalism. And as president of a professional body with about 23,000 members in the UK, I ask myself this question all the time: what is professional practice? Do we need a research culture to be professional? Do individual practitioners actually need to be researchers in order to be professional? And is the evidence-based library and information practice really the same as good professional practice? So that was when I started as president in 2004 at CILIP. My theme were the 3 R's of professional practice, and they were reflective practice, which I interpreted as how we learn from analyzing our own practice, retrieving the evidence, how we learn from the practice of others as reported in the literature, and researching key questions, how we learn through research about improvements to practice. Now, if you look at the literature on professionalism, if you hear Starr, he says that professionals are an occupation that regulates itself through systemic, required training and collegial discipline, that has a base in technical and specialist knowledge, and that has a service rather than a profit orientation enshrined in its code of ethics. Well, that describes, I think, librarianship very well. Friedson went on to say that there were 6 characteristics of professional practice: service, which is about achieving important social ends; understanding, creating a body of knowledge through research; practice, in which he says that knowledge base may be generated through research, but it has to be tested in practice; judgment, that professionals are not just conduits from theory to practice, but apply judgment with both technical and moral elements to that; learning, that professionals learn from both research and experience, and he describes this as reflective practice; and community, that we have a distributed expertise, but essentially we have a core body of knowledge and skills. So let me go through these very, very generally, because I do believe that we are a professional body and that research is important. So my emphasis when I was president was about reflective practice. And I was reading a lot about the literature from Donald Shawn about professionalism, in which he states the capacity to reflect on action so as to engage in a process of continuous learning is the hallmark of professionalism. And that harks back to what Dave Sackett said, evidence-based medicine is lifelong reflective learning. It involves thoughtfully considering one's own experience and applying knowledge to practice while being coached by others in the discipline. And that's something we haven't talked an awful lot about, I think, in evidence-based practice, about the role of mentors, the role of senior members of the profession, helping us shape those key questions, not only of our own practice, but of the profession in general. And it requires, obviously, keeping up to date with the knowledge base of the profession, and it requires time and effort to ask the key questions. And that was what I was trying to get CILIP and its members to think about, that reflective practice really has to be built into the way we go forward in the United Kingdom. Evidence-based practice, I've talked a lot about my own experience with EBP, but the important thing here, and from the professional librarian's point of view in the UK, was it's not just about being in contact with the knowledge base of the profession, but making sure that any implicit or tacit knowledge that you gain from experience or from your mentors has to be supplemented with the best available explicit knowledge from sources that are valid, reliable, and applicable. And as we've already heard today, this is one of the issues for us as librarians, is about where, besides LISA and library literature and all those abstracts, where are we getting our valid, reliable, and applicable databases of primary and secondary evidence? And again, it's about making sure that we ask the right questions, that we use the right research evidence, and we disseminate in the right places. So from my point of view, evidence-based practice, again, is the second very important part of being a professional librarian. And the third, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this, is about research into practice. This is, Joanne and Andrew know, is one of my topics and pet peeves in a way, because Joanne really inspired me to be very interested in research from an early stage in my career. And I was very fortunate to become the Chief Executive of the Library and Information Commission in 1996. And one of our objectives was really to develop a national research strategy for the library and information profession in the UK. And up until that point, there had been a considerable volume of library and information research, led primarily by the British Library R&D Department, which actually had a unique fund of about £3 million per year to give for library and information research alone. This research was given to all sorts of researchers in public libraries, academic libraries, consultants, and it was there to be a bid for. So there were usually there was a pot of money people could actually just put in a good proposal, and the BL would look at it and fund it. But I would have to say that one of the things that came out in the early days of review of the UK research scene was that there's very little evidence of work trying to translate that research into practice. There was no mention of evidence-based practice, and there was a view that a lot of the BLR-funded research was sitting and gathering dust and shelves in people's offices, mostly at British Library. So there was research output, but it was not being used. As we got closer to the creation of the LIC in 1996, there was a view that we needed more policy-driven research, we needed a strategy to bring the research efforts together, and we needed to show the evaluation, we needed to evaluate the impact of that research, how it actually had made a difference in our profession. So LIC was created with this goal of developing a national research strategy, which we described as an adaptive strategy for the profession to maximize its contribution to society, to anticipate change, to build on core skills, to improve collaboration, and to use innovative tools and technology. And our specific objectives were to improve the effectiveness and impact and value for money of research, to maintain a national agenda of research questions, to encourage intersectoral partnerships, to facilitate access to existing research knowledge, to produce evidence for policy and practice, and to stimulate and support insight and innovations. Now, don't get me started on this, but the great thing is we took over the BLR&D research pot. We were going to make sure that that $3 million was targeted very effectively along the lines of the strategy. We had 5 strategic themes, including outcomes and impact and evaluation of the economics of library and information service research. But unfortunately, about that time, there was a policy within the Labour government of culling quangos, and the Library and Information Commission was a quango, and it was actually ceased or abolished in 2000, and it was rolled in some of the functions to the new Museum, Libraries and Archives Council. Now that money for Library and Information Service research went to the MLA, and it was used to inform policy research, and so they commissioned studies where they needed to inform policy research, but that pot of money for researchers, practitioner researchers, disappeared. And although there was funding available through bodies like the Arts and Humanities Research Council and JISC, the Joint Information Systems Committee, it tended to go to academically based research organizations in universities. And so access to research money outside the academic environment became very, very difficult. And in 2003, CILIP commissioned the Centre for Information Research Technology at University of Central England to do a review of LIS research in the UK. And the CERT report, many of you have seen, the Nankivell-McNichol report, and basically what it found was, again, that the research funders lacked vision in relation to our areas of discipline. There was an overall lack of coordination and planning. There was a lack of funding, a lack of transferable research skills, a lack of funding for practitioners who didn't have the academic liaison. There was a failure of practitioners to implement research findings, a failure of policymakers to be aware of commissioned and completed research. There was poor communication between research and practitioners. There was inadequate education and research methods, and there were a lack of employer incentives and interest in research. So basically, still a fairly gloomy picture. And that led to CILIP developing its own research strategy in 2005, which advocated that CILIP had a lead role to take forward research in the United Kingdom. And I'll come back to that. So from my perspective as president in 2004 and for the 3 years I was involved in leadership of CILIP, how did CILIP do in terms of adopting evidence-based practice into professional practice? Well, I think there were some good things that happened. We launched a new framework of qualifications that involved associateship for those who were not professional librarians, membership and fellowship. All of this was based on reflective practice and reflective portfolios of evidence. It was all based on the principle of lifelong learning. That's why recertification was introduced. And so evidence-based practice and reflective practice do appear very large in our framework of qualifications. In terms of training, CILIP has recently commissioned and delivered research skills training courses and evidence-based practice training to its members. And there was an adoption of the research strategy, but I would have to say it's primarily in principle. There was no real funding or advocacy that went behind it. And I'm going to search for Bruce Madge, who's somewhere in the audience. He was over here, but he's moved, I think. Oh, there he is, way at the back. To say that I was one of the first medical librarians to be president of CILIP. We have at the moment Ian Snowley, who's president, who also has a medical background. And Bruce is our president for 2008. And Bruce, I'm looking at you, because the research strategy, which largely stemmed from the Health Libraries Group and the research group in CILIP, has to be taken forward, and some money and advocacy has to go along with this if we're really going to deliver on what the original goals that the prospects and the LIC strategy had in 1998. So overall, I would say in the UK, there's increasing awareness of evidence-based practice, there's increasing research, and there's increasing practitioners who are doing it, but it's still not seen as core. I wouldn't say it's core to CILIP, and that's where it needs to be. And that requires leadership. And Bruce, you're it. So let me go on now to the third driver, which is knowledge management. And you may be saying to me, well, where did knowledge management come in? Isn't it the antithesis of evidence-based practice? It's all about knowledge and intuition sharing. But I was dealing with knowledge management as a key sort of management paradigm that was emerging at the same time as evidence-based medicine, particularly in the financial and commercial sectors, and I have to say in the NHS and in government. And one of my posts was the Director of Research and Knowledge Management for the NHS in the Southeast. And then I became Director of Knowledge Management for the Modernization Agency. So it wasn't something that was going to go away. It was something that people were really almost in a reaction in some ways to the evidence-based hard research evidence movement, looking at what knowledge management could do for the NHS and for other organizations. And of course, those of you who know about knowledge management know that it recognized the value of tacit knowledge and experience to organizational competitiveness, and a lot of things were done to support knowledge communities of practice, to manage intellectual capital, to harvest knowledge. But if you go back again to David Sackett's definition, it is about lifelong learning, it is about reflective practice, and it's about using evidence to supplement professional experience and judgment, or to inform judgment. So one of the things that I learned from my experience with knowledge management in the NHS and later at King's was that it is a very long-term strategy, and that you can't force knowledge sharing, but you can initiate ways to encourage and reward. It does require training, resources, and leadership, and it does require some evidence of impact. And one of the things I was glad to do when I was Director of R&D was to fund a research program into knowledge management so we could have some evidence-based knowledge management. Well, what's the relationship between libraries, knowledge management, and evidence-based practice? To me, this is the other side of the coin. This is about creating a culture where knowledge sharing is a natural way of working. And it isn't. I've worked in universities, and you would think that universities that are all about knowledge generation are good at sharing knowledge. Well, they're not. They may be good at sharing within their own disciplines, but often within their own universities, they're very competitive and they don't like to share. So if we're going to encourage evidence-based practice, which has got to be about getting research into practice, it's got to be about communication. It's got to be about a culture where we willingly and are rewarded for sharing what we know, for sharing negative results to get ideas about how maybe we could have transformed our research. We've really got to be much more communicative. And that's what I took from knowledge management, that it is another sort of arrow in our weapons, to actually improve practice through improving communication. The fourth driver, and I suppose it's really more about context, is that having started on a career now as a university administrator, I recognized that if I was going to cope with some of the changes that I've listed up there, things like what's the role of librarianship in e-science and data archiving, what's our role in technology-based education, WebCT, how do we lead the open access movement, how are we going to make sure that our contribution to increasing university competitiveness is recognized and shown? How do we deal with this new generation of students who are very knowledge savvy, very rights savvy, who want a different kind of service from us? They don't want just the, tell me how to use the indexes. They want information delivered to them in the way that often corporate libraries find. So they're very demanding, new students. And the information that we get from the national student surveys are helping us look at what our students say in relation to students globally. So a lot of things that are actually putting a lot of challenges on university libraries. And I felt that evidence-based practice was actually one of the ways that I was going to cope with that. So what I want to do now, first of all, is just summarize what I learned from evidence-based practice and from knowledge management and the organizational change, and then give you a couple of case studies about how I've been trying to implement that. So my lessons, what I did was I learned a lot from evidence-based education, librarianship, and medicine about how to take that forward. I learned a lot and focused a lot on what it means to be a professional and how research and evidence-based practice can factor into that. I learned that evidence-based practice, to me, supports and complements tacit approach of knowledge management. I learned that it could help with organizational change, competitiveness, and decision-making. And for me, the most exciting thing is, again, its expanded roles for the library and information profession. So I want to go on to tell you a little bit about two case studies. Having been cheerleader for nearly 15 years, I am now going to be an evidence-based practitioner. And I started that in 2003 when I went to King's College London. And I've recently moved back to Canada to Carleton. And it's interesting to compare these two because they're exactly the same size of university, 24,000 students. But King's is a long-established, research-intensive university, very focused on health sciences. 2/3 of the programs are health. We had a new president who was very interested in particularly external competitiveness in international markets. And there was a new information and knowledge strategy and a new research strategy that could really drive change at the university. Carleton, on the other hand, very new university. It's a very general university. There's no dominant faculty. We also had a new president. In fact, in the last year we've had two. In fact, I've had 3 bosses. And so it's been an interesting time to be at Carleton. Again, a focus on student academic success and external competitiveness. And again, new strategies for research and libraries. So some common threads, but actually 2 very different universities. So starting with King's, which is very much a traditional university, and I inherited a staff which was a converged service of library, IT, and archive people. They were very well used to staff development. They were used to change because King's had been through merger after merger over the last few years. It was a very distributed campus. There were, as I say, archivists, IT people, and librarians, so different professional cultures. There were no sabbatical or research leaves at King's, which is an interesting point, but a very strong history of information literacy support. The college itself had a strong pedagogical research network, so EBE was working at the college. Multidisciplinary research and evidence-based practice was well understood because of the health schools. There was a strong open access movement because the Research Councils UK were encouraging and almost insisting upon publication in open access repositories, and there was a new information strategy. In trying to embed evidence-based practice in my own team, we did this partly through staff development. Staff were given training in evidence-based library and information practice, and Anne Bryce came and ran a course for us. I identified one of my staff to be an EBLIP specialist who actually made sure that everything we did was evidence-based. Anytime any staff put in a bid for development work, I insisted that it be evidence-based. and we encouraged a very active research partnership. In the way that, in terms of the way we delivered our services, we did a lot of research into our e-learning pilots because that was our responsibility. We did double cohort studies in information literacy. We linked that to our quality assessment and LibQual programs, and we did try some of the qualitative KM techniques such as story analysis to investigate the key service questions. In the university, we were also trying to support evidence-based practice. We had staff seconded to assist with systematic reviews. We had people who were actually running virtual research networks like the EIGER, the e-learning network, and our staff were actually the facilitators of that, much modeled on the model of the specialist libraries in the National Electronic Library for Health. We were responsible for developing the research gateway and disseminating research evidence, and we led an open access. So a number of things here. We also tried to embed critical appraisal and retrieval skills in a graduate research literacy skills program. So we were very research, very evidence-based focused in the services that we delivered. And finally, the Living Knowledge Strategy, which is our 10-year knowledge strategy, focused entirely on knowledge sharing, reflective practice, and evidence-based practice, and it was well accepted at King's. So where did we get to by the time I left in 2006? I would say we were doing quite well at King's, but these are some of the things that I think we could have done better. We needed more in-house research and sharing of experiences. We did well with the EIGER, the virtual e-learning network, but we had many, many other areas where we could have supported virtual research networks. Critical appraisal skills were seen very lacking in the university, even in, I have to say, some of the medical faculty. So the staff who had them in the library, it wasn't enough for the library staff to have these. We needed to disseminate these skills throughout the university. We needed time. All my staff said, I would do more of this, but I simply don't have the time. I can't get the time away from my day job. And I think really importantly, while there was a shift towards evidence-based practice in some of the academics, and certainly in the library, it wasn't there in management. And I used to keep getting asked questions, why are you investing all this money in knowledge management and EBP initiatives? And I really didn't have the research evidence to prove the return on investment. So the evidence of the impact of our work needed to be there, and it wasn't. And I think we really needed to work harder on our new president and the senior management team to get them fully behind us in evidence-based practice. So it's not just the early adopters and innovators in the university, we needed the management on side as well. And the other thing I would have to say, and I haven't been at King's for a year, but I have been keeping in touch, I think, and I'm not being sort of immodest when I say this, but I think when I left, the momentum for it left. And I think that's one of the dangers for evidence-based library and information practice. We're a lot of enthusiasts here in the audience, and there are leaders here in the audience, but we have to make sure that it's embedded in the way we work, and it's not just embedded in one person's personal agenda. So I think, you know, we've got a way to go before the leadership actually is at all levels of the profession. At Carleton, and I realize I'm getting close to my end of my time, I'm going to try to speed through this. The situation at Carleton was very different. When I went to Carleton last May, and I've been there a year, sometimes I find that hard to believe, I found a very different setup. The library staff had been in post for their entire career at Carleton. There's very, very little change in staff. Most of them had been there for 30 or 40 years. There's only one library, only one campus, and most people in the library thought the library meant the building. So the library services were only what happened in the McCodrum building. There was a very strong support of learning and teaching through e-learning, but actually no real interest in supporting research activities or corporate information management. And while there was a culture of quality assessment, there was no research. Well, having said that, my staff, I don't know how many of this applies in here, I'm in a university where the contract, the staff are part of the faculty union, they get sabbaticals every 3 years, they get 6 months, and every 6 years they get a year. And that is a right. It's not an opportunity or a privilege. It is a right, and they take it. But have they done any library and information service research? None. If they've done research, it's been in their own subject specialty like sociology or law or education. They don't see the link, or they haven't until now, seen the link that their sabbaticals are there to generate research for the profession. And I have to say that I think their research skills are quite poor. Having said that, there are some on the staff who really do want a new library direction. The university also has had very little change until a recent dramatic shuffle at the top. We've recently lost 2 presidents, 2 VPs, and 3 deans. So there's kind of a leadership vacuum at Carleton at the moment. Evidence-based practice is not discussed, not mentioned, except by a few professional faculties like social work. There's no information or knowledge strategy. There's serious issues around retention of students. But on the positive side, in this shuffle at the top, I found a new ally in the research VP who's very interested in evidence-based practice and the role of librarians. And I think I'm going to use this vacuum at the top to my advantage in terms of pushing the library forward into new roles. And by doing that, by basically using my new strategic plan, which we've just released for the next 3 years. And in it, the library staff are going to be committed to making a greater contribution to university research through library-supported networks. So one of the things the new VB research said is, while we're not a health school, we actually have 60 units at Carleton that have some connection with health. I'd like to have a virtual health research network to facilitate the knowledge sharing and the evidence sharing amongst these research units. And I've actually volunteered one of my staff, which has a background in medical librarianship, to be the facilitator for that network. We're going to do many more outreach services, including graduate information literacy and management programs that focus on critical appraisal skills and information literature retrieval. We're going to provide support for corporate information management, whether they want it or not. And we are going to emphasize continuing professional development of all staff and demonstrating through the research that the library does make a contribution to student academic success and retention. My professional development plan is going to ensure that sabbaticals do provide evidence to the library and information profession through research or systematic reviews. And you might be interested in knowing that CARL, which is the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, has recently developed a research agenda with the educators in library schools in Canada to make sure that the academic research is actually addressing some of the questions of academic libraries. My 3 R's from CILIP are going to be translated or are being translated into my library, so that reflective practice, evidence-based practice, and research are going to be key elements of our operations. We will be encouraging external partnerships and secondments to bring new ideas, because I think bringing new people into the organization is very important. So I've already discussed with Ghislaine the idea of some secondments and exchanges between Europe and North America, and I want Carleton to be part of that. But the most important thing to get back to knowledge management is there has to be a culture of knowledge sharing, and there hasn't been in this library. We've started doing away days, and these away days are seminars that are given by staff for staff, and everyone has to attend. And they have to participate in some way or the other. And I don't care what they teach each other. It could be salsa dancing, it could be Indian cooking, it doesn't matter. It could be kickboxing. And we actually had an away day last week, and we had all 3 seminars on those as well, along with other evidence things. What I want my staff to realize is that they have knowledge and expertise that they need to share with other people, and get them into routine of volunteering their expertise, whatever it is, and volunteering to participate in seminars, and get that lively flow of debate and questioning and knowledge sharing just as matter of course of the library environment. So in terms of Carleton, I would say that it is a major effort to change very long-standing processes and attitudes. There is a danger because only my professional staff get sabbaticals, that only they will see themselves having a role to play in contributing new research. And that's something that I really have to address. I want all staff at all levels to be interested in evidence-based practice. But I do need to make sure that those who do get sabbaticals are focusing their research on our profession. As I mentioned before, I think the reshuffle at the top of our university provides me an opportunity to change the strategic direction of the library and to make it more evidence-based. But one of my keys is to find allies within the university, and I've done that with social work and the new VP research, and I'll be looking for further allies. So I want to build on evidence-based partnerships within the university. And one of the great new partnerships in the Ottawa area is that the University of Ottawa has a new library school, and the dean of that library school has done something which I think Joanne has already done, and UZ here, which is offer co-op students at master's and PhD level to local libraries so that they can actually help with the research and support the research project. So I'm very interested in taking that forward. So my overall conclusions, Andrew, you'll be glad to know I'm down to 3 slides. Isn't that great? I'll start with the negative things, and I don't think this will be a surprise to you because many of you reported this in your recent articles. I'm a bit disappointed, I think, that there's a lack of funding to support LIS research. And as I mentioned in the UK experience, we've suffered from the loss of that £3 million. And we've got to get that back in some way. So I want to see more funding. I'm kind of disappointed that we haven't seen more systematic reviews. I know they are developing, and I think that's great. But I think I want, and I've said this once a long time ago in 1993, to a SCONL group, this is University Librarians in England when I was NHS Library Advisor, why don't you ask your staff to do systematic reviews instead of original research? It would make probably a better contribution, and it never happened. And this is what I'm now going to take forward with my CARL colleagues in Canada and my own staff. I want to see systematic reviews. I want them trained in doing systematic reviews, and I want them to do that review. It's as important as doing a primary piece of research. I'm also a bit disappointed. I don't know how many university library directors there are here. Hands up? One. Okay. I'm a bit disappointed that evidence-based practice is not a buzzword at senior library directors' meetings. It seems to be something they think is done by their staff. And I think this is another major challenge for this. The senior members of our profession have to be as evidence-based as anyone else. I'm disappointed that evidence-based practice is a little bit still a fringe, particularly within CILIP. You listening to this, Bruce? And also, I think, in some other sectors. It's got to be the heart of all sectors of our profession. And I suppose I'm a bit disappointed myself that I haven't been able to do more to embed evidence-based practice in my own libraries. But I'm beginning. I'm now a player, a practitioner, and I'm going to make a difference. In terms of the positive conclusions, I'm very pleased with the focus on research strategies. MLA and CILIP have developed these strategies. Carl is developing. So there is an awareness that there is a need for vision. There's a need for coordination and strategy. I'm really pleased at the way that evidence-based practice has begun to be embedded in professional standards as CILIP and MLA, but it needs to be everywhere. I'm very pleased that there's a growing body of research, as Anne and Andrew mentioned in their article. There is more than double the number of research articles in our profession, and we need to see that grow exponentially. I'm terrifically pleased to see the tools, the open access journals, the online networks, and I am a member of Facebook's evidence-based practice group. If you haven't belonged to Facebook, it's great to do it and join our group. There's about 70 members, I gather. And I'm glad to see so many experts that are available to help others. And I suppose I am optimistic. I have a vehicle at my disposal, 30 people on sabbatical leave, and hopefully not all together, but that we can make a difference because we will produce some research. That's a commitment I'm going to make to you. We will produce research evidence that you can use and others can use in your practice. So my final slide is parting thoughts. I have to say I was really impressed with Andrew this morning that he didn't have more puns other than, if you know Andrew, he's very fond of puns and acronyms. Well, I've got an acronym, which is EBLIP. And it stands for educating all of the LIS workforce in evidence-based practice, not just professional librarians and not just medical librarians. Broadening our community. I'm going to start coughing now. I think there's an issue here, and we've said it before in the literature, that we're quite English-speaking country dominated in this community, and I think we need to broaden it out. I had a really interesting discussion with Ghislaine from Belgium about why there isn't more evidence-based practice in Southern Europe and in the low-resource and developing countries. And a suggestion for all of you is perhaps your next conference should be in Europe or somewhere where we can invite people sorry, from the low-resource countries. I knew I'd make it partway through. Terrible way to finish. I think we need to link evidence-based practice with professional standards. We need to increase LIS research evidence. And most important, we need to promote to our organizations, employers, and managers and funders the impact of evidence-based practice. So I'm going to finish because I can't talk anymore with a quote from Andrew and Anne's article. 15 years on, 10 years on, evidence-based library and information practice, the time has come for us to mature from being problem-focused to solution-focused. And I want to be part of the solution, and I'm very pleased to be part of this community, which I think will be the solution. Thank you very much. So sorry.
Well, I did say that Margaret was an inspiring speaker, but even I didn't think she could continue to her own eye.
Yeah.
Perhaps to give Margaret a little time to pause for the education. Margaret's outlined quite a few ways of getting evidence-based practice embedded into libraries. Perhaps, as I say, to give her a little bit of breathing space, would anyone like to comment on any of those that they've seen Margaret present that are actually going on within their own practice, just to start us off? Any of these things about perhaps staff investigating evidence-based problems, or are there evidence-based journals? I know I'm asking you to do some other work, but...
Anybody got a cough drop?
Anyone like to say what's being done in their organisations? Yes, please. Could you say your name and I'll...
Brilliant, thank you. Sure. Robert Tesson, yay! My name is Michelle Halliwell, and we've met before anyway, so I will be back from Oregon in Western Nova Scotia Health Authorities, and I'm a practitioner in a non-academic setting, and manager in practice and knowledge management. And so she is pushing us towards best practice in information management and looking at standards. And in order to support that, we have to do our own research and go through the ethics process and all of that before we can create recommendations about how to go forward. And one of the things that you said, Margaret, please continue, was about how you have staff who have the incredible luxury of a sabbatical. And I'm very fortunate because my manager is really pushing us to go ahead and put time into our own research on top of all our other duties. But I can foresee the gap continuing between academic-based librarians who can still go ahead and do that, have 6 months to do research, and someone working in a hospital setting or something like that, business library, whatever, is not going to have that 6 months every 2 or 3 years to go ahead and so I'm going to throw this back at you, which is how do we address that? Because that's, I think, a long, good haul.
I'll still give Margaret a little bit more time, but does anyone have perhaps more rapid approaches to looking at evidence to try and integrate it? Because obviously the ideal is the sort of like the 6-month systematic review model, but are there any in the audience who are experimenting with shorter versions of rapid appraisal, of briefly reviewing the evidence? Yes, please.
I'm just going to comment on that. And it's also a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that wasn't a question.
I'm wondering after this conversation what the difference is, and this does answer it partially, between the movement of process improvement and continuous learning that actually came out of the medical profession and moved into the research library. And in some ways, that also can be an onerous task. It takes a while, but Margaret, you were mentioning earlier how you can find cost benefits to support that. From my previous experience, I think that process improvement practice. Is that more practical and not research-based? Do you see that?
I'll just reflect the question back so that everyone can hear that. Thank you. That was nice and clear. So we're talking about the link between process or policy improvement and evidence-based practice. Obviously, Margaret's well positioned to respond to that. Vocally permitting.
Vocally permitting. Thank you to the lady that gave me the Robitussin cough drops. I have to say I just recovered from pneumonia, and I thought I had it down pat, but obviously talking for 45 minutes to an hour doesn't help. Can I come back to the first point about encouraging evidence-based practice in small libraries where they haven't the luxury of 6-month sabbaticals? And I think that is a very key point, and it's one that I address even in a large library like King's College London. And I think the issue is it's about not necessarily doing the research, but actually accepting that as a professional information worker, you have a responsibility to make sure that what you're doing is actually as evidence-based as you can make it, and therefore being familiar with the literature, being familiar or having the gumption, I think, perhaps beyond your working hours to spend some time searching the literature to address some of the questions you deal with. And one of the things that CILIP did, which I thought was brilliant, was it made LISA freely available to all its members. So that if you're a member of CILIP, you have access online to LISA. There's no excuse for you not having being able to do that. But also, I think it's about countering the culture that you're, as a professional, your job is 9 to 5. Basically, it isn't. You put in the hours you need to put in order to make sure that you are giving the best practice you can. Having said that, I think it is very difficult in smaller libraries particularly to get the time away from routine activities to do the research. And here I think the partnerships are really important. I really think that academic departments, particularly in the UK, and Chris Urquhart is here and probably could comment on that, there's more of an effort now to be in partnership with libraries and do research projects. There are practical value to practitioners and to actually do the research in these libraries using the librarians there as partners. They're not actually doing the research and the analysis, but they're there, they're working with the academics. So I think partnerships between academic researchers and practitioners is very important in order to get the research that answers the questions of those individuals. And then, of course, there's also consortium approaches. And one of the things we did at CILIP through LIRG, which is a Library and Information Research Group, was basically provide research skills training to other sectors of CILIP, so that we were trying to encourage those in the other sectors, whether it's business, commerce, schools, or whatever, public libraries, to actually develop the research skills so that they felt more comfortable in handling the research or perhaps designing in-house research projects. And research projects don't all have to be huge. I mean, they can be very small research projects and still contribute very valuable insights. So I think it's a question about spending the time, getting access to the evidence, and being in partnership with others to do the research. If you haven't the facility to take the time off and do a fairly large-scale research project yourself. And of course, as Andrew and others have said, it's quite important that we have these databases of secondary research and the summaries that we make available very easily to practitioners, so that they don't have to do all the searching and reviews of the primary evidence if they need it. So I think that's the way I would suggest doing it. And I think a key thing also, and it's an issue for me at Carleton because of the strong union there, that doing research is considered a professional activity and a faculty activity. And there's been a tendency to not encourage that to be done by non-faculty union members. And this is a tension for me. I want all staff, all support staff, library technicians, professional librarians, to be engaged in evidence-based practice. I'm not requiring them all to do research, but I want them to be aware, to be reflective, to ask each other questions, to question the way I'm doing things, to constantly be critical, and to think about how they're delivering services best for their patrons. So I think there's an issue about encouraging the principles of evidence-based practice throughout the library, whatever the opportunities are for research. To come back to the process improvement question, I mean, I'm not quite sure I heard all of it, but I think the issue for me is that, and it came up, I think, in Pam Ryan's article about the quality improvement initiatives in librarianship, all the evaluation, LibQual movements, and how does that relate to evidence-based practice. And I think they're simply, two, as I say, weapons in your arsenal, basically. They sit side by side. They shouldn't be seen as disparate activities. They're part of the same process. And I think one of the issues about evidence-based library and information practice is that as we've matured, we've looked at some of the qualitative approaches that are used in quality and process improvement in terms of, the surveys, the observational studies, and other things, and that's become part of the hierarchy of our evidence. So I think that they're not mutually exclusive activities. And I think in the NHS, a lot of the process improvement came out of things like the breakthrough collaboratives, the initiatives that brought individuals together that were developing and taking systems of healthcare and clinical care throughout the NHS, and they would educate each other. It was the knowledge sharing, how do you do it in your library or your hospital, and could we do it better in ours if we use the evidence but we actually agreed on a similar process. So the whole focus about knowledge sharing, collaboration, I think, is also very important in evidence-based practice. So I don't see them as separate. I see them as converging, perhaps with some differences, but converging to making a more improved practice.
We can perhaps have one or two more questions to take advantage of the fact that Margaret is with us. So.
And not coughing. Yay, Robitussin.
So, one or two last comments. We have one over there. If you'd like to say who you are, please.
I'm Suzanne Gerstein from the National Institute of Health Library. And my question concerns your comment about how your initiative at King's College seems to have died after your departure. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the factors that may have made that happen, and what can you do to assure that, let's say, if I'm doing something similar at NIH and I'm retiring in 2 years, that initiative won't die with me as well?
Well, that's a really good question, and I don't think it's completely died. I think that, I came in, my background is medical librarianship, as you know, and so this has always been something that's been of interest to me. And I came to a university where I didn't see it well practiced in my own team, and I really encouraged it, as I showed you by a number of initiatives. I will have to say that in that department, the archivists and the IT people were never very keen and never really took it on board. The librarians were, but many of them had been medical librarians. So there was already a group there that were aware of evidence-based practice and wanted to engage in it. I think some of the things that we started have continued. The e-learning virtual network, which is facilitated by the ISS staff, that continues. So there were pockets in the university where they were already engaged themselves in evidence-based practice and welcomed the support and the involvement of librarians. And I believe that they're still doing systematic reviews. So there is some of that effort continuing. Is it actually a part of the continuing professional development of all staff in ISS? I don't think so. And in fairness, I think the person who succeeded me, and there was a gap of about a year, has come from a different background from IT and has a different agenda, and her focus is getting on the IT infrastructure right in the university. My focus was on knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer in the university. So inevitably, it's going to shift. I think had I stayed there longer, and I was only there 3 years, and that's, I think, part of the problem. If I'd stayed there longer, I would have embedded it much more into the way we did professional development. We would have had our own body of research that we contributed. I think it would sort of just snowballed, I think. And I left too early. And that was my dilemma when I wanted to come back to Canada, was leaving King's at that time. So I think it does take time. Knowledge management strategies take time to embed. And I think that that's the issue. But also getting like-minded people around you who also believe in what you do so that they can carry on. And I think in my own situation, the one person is still there, very much involved in critical appraisal and open access. The other person, my evidence-based specialist, also left. So I think there was kind of a critical gap. In terms of Carleton, I think what I want to do is slightly different because of my experience at King's. And what I want to do there is get the library staff so engaged in external partnerships within the university with other research teams and other departments that they can't, even if they leave, there will be an expectation that the library will continue in that role. So that there's a lot of pressure, if you like, on the library from outside the library to continue engaging in those activities.
Right, well, thank you, Margaret, and thanks to the audience for your provocative questions. I'm sure some of those issues will be picked up in the succeeding sessions, but perhaps could we give a round of applause of thanks to Margaret. Just a reminder to the members of the International Programme Committee and others who volunteered that we've got a brief meeting about the criteria for awards straight after this meeting. But now I hand back to Joanne. Joanne.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Margaret. Really, this is, it's so important for us to hear voices from other countries and what they are doing. I think especially one of the things I've noticed since coming to the United States is there's so much activity here, but we're definitely have much to learn from what has gone on in the UK in the field of library and information science and in other countries where we'll have speakers from those countries as well. So that's something that makes this very special. And I do thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's really great to have you here. Just a reminder, we'll be reconvening then in half an hour for the 3 concurrent sessions. They're listed on your program, and 2 of them are on either side. So this is one huge ball.